Hi everyone, welcome or welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Lauren, and today I'm going to be doing my spring cleaning book unhaul. So, full disclosure, I don't have nearly as many books to unhaul this time around as I have in the past couple of unhauls. However, I still feel like this is enough to film an unhaul, and plus I am just really in the mood to do some spring cleaning on my shelves. If you're curious what I do with books when I unhaul them, I generally will just resell them to my local secondhand bookstore. I've lately been considering trying out Pango, selling my books on pango.com, so I don't know, maybe a couple of these I'll throw up there and see how that goes. So for this unhaul, I have decided to divide this up into 3 different sections. Books that I enjoyed but will never read again, books that I thought were pretty meh and will never read again, and books that I actively disliked and will definitely never read again. So let's just jump right in and talk about the books. Alright, so the first group of books I have here are books that I have read, and I enjoyed them, but I just know that I will never read them again, so I don't see the point of holding on to them. The first of these is Divergent. Not that I will never read Divergent again, but I will never read this copy again. I got a much nicer copy several months back. Who of us likes whenever they put this, like, the little sticker that's not a sticker about a movie or a TV show or whatever? No need to have both of them anyway, so I am going to be letting this one go. Next is The Nirvana Effect by Brian Pinkerton. This was kind of this was a VR sci-fi novel, like a VR kind of dystopian, I guess, like a dystopian sci-fi. And I did enjoy this while I read it, but this is just one of those books that I don't know, I could eat my words in the future, but I just really don't think I'm going to read it again. It was a good time while I read it, but it wasn't spectacular. I do still recommend it, but I'm not going to read it again. Next is Salvation Day by Kaylee Wallace. I did like this book, but this is one of those books that I started forgetting it as soon as I was finished with it. This was a pretty run-of-the-mill sort of space opera sci-fi, almost kind of horror, although it wasn't particularly scary. I guess more like thriller sci-fi. If I recall correctly, this was the trope of some sort of disease has broken out on a ship and everyone is slowly getting infected, which it's all right. I mean, I have a good time reading it, but it's not something that, it's not a favorite. And I do like the way that Kaylee Wallace writes, and I would recommend it, but I'm not going to read it again. Next up is The Future of Another Timeline by Annalee Newitz. This obviously, I mean, you can tell by the title, this was like all about time travel and, you know, trying to like correct things from the past and make changes in time, which is an interesting concept. I actually really love time travel in books. I don't know, this just wasn't a favorite for me. This didn't really do anything special or stand out in any way. As is, I feel like the once was enough. And so I think I'm going to go on ahead and just pass this along to the next person. And lastly, we have Quality Land by Marc-Uwe Kling. I thought this was actually a lot of fun. This was also a sci-fi novel and kind of satirical, kind of funny. I guess you could classify this as sort of dystopian, and it was very humorous. It followed a character who basically, as a lot of dystopians, sort of what happens in them, a character who sort of sees problems with the system and sees that it isn't a great system and tries to correct it, and the system is very resistant, and that's kind of the obstacle to overcome. It was fun, but also just not particularly special, and yeah, I don't think I'll read this one again. All right, next up we have books that I thought were pretty meh, and because of that, I'm not gonna read them again. First, we have The Sleepless by Victor Manabo. This book definitely did not do anything wrong, but this was very kind of a detective story, and those types of stories are just not for me, like whenever they're very procedural, and which was unfortunate because this book is set in a world where this sleeping sickness has infected a certain percentage of the population, which I think is an incredibly interesting premise and made me really excited to read this. I didn't even finish it and kind of lied to myself and told myself that I would, but I know now that some time has passed, I just don't have any interest in picking it back up, so I think I'm going to let this one go. The next one is What Comes After by Joanne Tompkins. I don't even think I mentioned this while I was reading it. This was a read it when I get in bed kind of a book. This is more of kind of a contemporary literary literary kind of book, which I can enjoy from time to time, and I do enjoy from time to time, but this was, for me, this was a really bland story. It took me a long time to get through it. I think this was almost entirely just about like character development and kind of building these relationships between characters, and not much happened. I'm sure though, for people who are really more into these genres, might feel differently about it, but for me, this just didn't do it for me. Next up, and this kind of hurts me to say it, it is The Air Affair by Jasper Fforde. Jasper Fforde, I love Jasper Fforde, he's one of my favorite authors, but this was one of those books where like the longer I was in it, I was reading it faster and faster, not because I was like super sucked into it and really fascinated, but because I just kind of wanted it to be over. It's like eating a food you don't like as fast as you can just to get it off of your plate. It's sort of like magical realism, I guess, where characters can like jump in and out of paintings, which is a fun premise, but for me, it just, I don't know, I never really got invested in the story or the characters. I didn't think the characters were very interesting. It was just so close to being something that I would really love, but ultimately just not. Next up, another one that kind of hurts me, and that is Dead Astronauts by Jeff Vandermeer. This hurts me because one of my all-time favorite books is Born by Jeff Vandermeer. This is the second book in that series. I guess it's really a duology. This was a huge disappointment for me. This really, to me, had nothing to do with Born. I mean, it's set in the same world and there's some like crossover, but what I really mean by that is that this was almost like a book of poetry. I think if someone went into this book knowing that and really enjoyed those types of books, I can see how this would be a very enjoyable book for some people, but for me, I don't know. I felt like it was kind of a bait and switch. I thought that this was actually going to go hand in hand with Born, and it just doesn't. And last but not least, we have Survivor by Chuck Palahniuk. This is the second book that I have read by this author. The first was Fight Club, which I also feel like is a pretty meh book. And just to be clear, I love Fight Club, the movie. I love the idea of it, the concept, like the whole thing, great, but that book just not a good book. This, I felt like, kind of exposed Chuck Palahniuk as being sort of a one-trick pony whenever it comes to writing like young male characters. The protagonist of this book was completely, in my opinion, completely interchangeable with the protagonist of Fight Club. It was all right, enjoyable while I was reading it, but I did, as I was going along, found myself trying to speed up just to get through it really quickly as well. So I think it's very, very unlikely that I will ever want to pick this book up again. All right, and last but not least, we have books that I absolutely disliked and will not be rereading them because I just thought that they were awful for one reason or the other. And the first one is We Need to Do Something by Max Booth III. I read this pretty recently, and this book actually really irritated me. This is a horror novel, and it's about a family who's like trapped in their bathroom during a huge storm, and something blocks the door so they can't open the door. Like, they're really trapped in their bathroom. The foreword by the author, he talks about how this is like domestic nihilism, like a subgenre, a new subgenre called domestic nihilism. And if that's really a thing, it does that well, but I don't like it if that's what it is. Like, all these characters were wildly unlikable. I know that they made this into like a movie, I guess, and I can see how this would translate well into a movie. But for a book, this just, every second of it was like pure misery. This family was miserable, and it made me miserable as a reader, but there was no, I don't get the point of it. So yeah, I guess domestic nihilism does sound like, I guess, accurate, but it's clearly just not, it's not a genre for me. Next up, we have Vessel by Lisa A. Nichols. This is a sci-fi novel about a woman who is an astronaut, and she comes back. She's been like missing in space for many, many years with her crew. She comes back. She's the only one alive. All of her crew has died. And it's about her just sort of reacclimating to everyday life. And this book drove me nuts in a way, a very specific way. This woman made just the most unbelievably awful choices that I found very unrealistic for someone who is an astronaut. This woman was like basically blacking out and losing time, and was just like, I don't think I'm going to tell anyone about that. And I just I don't feel like that is realistic for an astronaut to like make a choice that bad. And so this book just really, really irritated me. I will never read this book again. Next up, we have a book that I actually just finished reading, and I'm not going to go into great detail about it because I will talk about it in my March wrap up, but it is Wakers by Orson Scott Card. I'm not going to talk about the plot or anything. Just suffice it to say that, like, I didn't like this book. I will have a lot to say about it in my wrap-up, but, like, this was not a good book. Like, this is really not a good book. And it's supposed to be the first in, I think, a trilogy, which baffles my mind. But yeah, I'm not going to read this again, so it's got to go. Next up is another book that has astronauts in it that I find completely unrealistic, and it is The Wanderers by Meg Howry. This one was less about the astronauts making wildly unrealistic choices and more about them being just absolutely awful people. Every character in this book was either just completely fake, completely judgmental, and pretty hateful, or kind of an idiot. There were no, like, just average people in it, if that makes sense. And so I ended up DNFing this, I think, at like a third or half of the way through, or maybe even less than that. Like, this was just the most tedious thing to try to read. These people were just so awful that I couldn't handle it. I don't know, maybe someone out there might really love it, but that person is not me. And last but not least, another book that the characters, astronaut type characters that are awful and unbelievable, and it is Do You Dream of Terra 2 by Temi O. This is the story of a group of, like, teenagers, teenage astronauts, basically. They're on a voyage aboard a ship trying to get to Terra 2, like a new home world, a new planet for the human race. They've sent these teenagers because they have to be young enough to be able to make this voyage. It's very, a long distance, obviously. These characters, oh my gosh, this was so obnoxious. These characters were so obnoxious to me. I just don't think that teenagers in general, but especially teenagers that have been selected for a mission like this, would be this wildly immature. And not to mention the fact there are a few adults on board, but they have almost no role, and they just sort of let these teenagers, like, run wild and do whatever they want. I definitely tried to give this book some grace because it is a young adult novel. However, I just can't stand books about astronauts who are this bad at being astronauts. That is just so unbelievable. Like, I can't handle it. So I'm going to be letting this one go as well. So I think that's going to be it. Those are all of the books that I am going to be unhauling for my spring clean. I'd be very curious to hear what you thought about all this. Hopefully I didn't just insult you over your all-time favorite book. I certainly don't mean to offend anyone, but these books, I'm just never going to read any of these again. So I think it's a far more kind thing to let them get into the hands of people who might really love them. I would, however, love to know what you thought about any of these books that you agree with or that you disagree with, that you think I didn't give it a fair shot for whatever reason. I hope that you will talk to me about it in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, I hope that you will like it and possibly subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.